Whoopi Goldberg mocked John Kennedy's faith on live TV. His response left her speechless. The stage of The View buzzed with electric anticipation, its sleek design and vibrant lighting casting a glow over the packed audience. The set, with its modern glass table and plush chairs, radiated a polished energy, a fitting backdrop for a show known for sparking bold conversations. At the heart of it all sat Whoopi Goldberg, a titan of American media, her presence commanding yet approachable, her quick wit and warm smile a beacon for millions. Today's episode, billed as Spirituality and the Meaning of Life, promised a deep dive into faith, purpose, and the diverse ways people navigate their inner worlds. The audience, a mix of loyal fans and curious newcomers, clapped enthusiastically as the cameras rolled, broadcasting live to homes across the nation. Whoopi, dressed in a flowing, colorful ensemble that mirrored her eclectic spirit, exuded confidence. She was in her element, ready to guide the discussion with her trademark blend of humor and insight. But beneath her poised exterior lay a calculated plan shared only with her co-hosts and producers to challenge the Christian faith of her special guest, Senator John Neely Kennedy from Louisiana. Known for his blunt honesty and deep-rooted values, Kennedy was a figure who didn't shy away from speaking about his beliefs, even when it stirred controversy. Whoopi, with her sharp intellect and media savvy, saw an opportunity to put him on the spot, to make him squirm under the weight of her questions before a global audience. She believed she could expose the rigidity of his faith, framing it as out of step with a world that celebrated diversity and open-mindedness. What she didn't anticipate was that this moment, this carefully orchestrated clash, would unfold in ways that would leave her rattled and the audience transfixed. As Senator Kennedy stepped onto the stage, a hush fell over the crowd. His navy suit was neatly tailored, but understated, a reflection of a man who valued substance over flash. In his jacket pocket rested a small worn Bible, not for show, but as a quiet anchor, a reminder of why he'd agreed to this appearance. His steps were steady, his expression calm, with a faint smile that hinted at both warmth and resolve. The audience clapped politely, but there was a palpable tension in the air, a mix of curiosity and expectation. They knew Kennedy wasn't a typical politician. He was a man who wore his faith openly, unafraid of the criticism it often drew. Whoopi greeted him with her signature charm, her voice smooth and inviting. "Senator Kennedy, welcome to The View. It's such a pleasure to have you with us today," she said, her smile wide, but her eyes sharp, betraying a glint of strategy. "We're diving into a big topic, spirituality, purpose, what guides us through life." "I know this is going to be a great conversation," Kennedy nodded, settling into his chair with an easy grace. "Thank you, Whoopi. I'm glad to be here," he replied, his voice low and warm, laced with the unmistakable drawl of Louisiana's bayou country. His hands rested lightly on his knees, his posture relaxed but alert, like a man who knew he was walking into a storm but trusted he'd come out the other side. In his heart, he sensed this wasn't just another talk show appearance. He'd heard about Whoopi's eclectic approach to spirituality, her advocacy for mindfulness, self-discovery, and universal paths to peace. He respected her influence, but was prepared to stand firm if his beliefs were challenged. Before arriving, he'd taken a moment alone to pray, asking for wisdom and courage to speak truthfully, no matter the cost. This wasn't about winning a debate. It was about honoring something bigger than himself. Whoopi kicked off the discussion with light, disarming questions, setting a comfortable tone for the audience. "Senator, tell us about your work in Louisiana," she began, leaning forward slightly. "How do you connect with folks back home, especially in such a divided world?" Kennedy's eyes lit up, and he leaned into the question with sincerity. Well, Whoopi, Louisiana's full of good people, farmers, teachers, fishermen, who just want to live their lives and take care of their families. I spend a lot of time listening to them, hearing their stories. That's what keeps me grounded." His voice carried a touch of Southern humor, and he tossed in a quick anecdote about a lively town hall meeting in Baton Rouge that drew chuckles from the crowd. The audience relaxed, charmed by his down-to-earth demeanor. Whoopi nodded her smile encouraging, but her mind was already shifting gears. She wasn't here for pleasantries. She wanted to dig deeper to steer the conversation toward the heart of her plan. The stage lights seemed to sharpen as she pivoted her tone, still warm, but now edged with purpose. "That's wonderful, Senator, and I love hearing about your connection to your community," she said, her eyes narrowing just enough to signal a change. "But let's get into something you talk about a lot, your Christian faith. You've said it's the foundation of everything you do. Now, in a world as diverse as ours, where people find meaning in so many ways, Buddhism, meditation, even no religion at all, don't you think it's a little limiting to say there's only one path to truth?" The question landed like a well-aimed arrow, striking at the core of Kennedy's publicly professed beliefs. The audience fell silent, their eyes darting between Whoopi and Kennedy, waiting for his response. Some leaned forward, intrigued by the challenge. Others shifted uncomfortably, sensing the weight of the moment. In a culture that prized inclusivity, the idea of one exclusive path to truth felt almost provocative, and Whoopi knew it. She was banking on Kennedy, either doubling down, which could paint him as narrow-minded, or softening his stance, which might undermine his credibility. It was a trap expertly set, and she leaned back slightly, confident she'd cornered him. But Kennedy didn't flinch. He met Whoopi's gaze, then turned to the audience, his eyes warm and steady, the kind of look that made you feel he was speaking directly to you. "Whoopi, let me tell you about a woman named Clara from Shreveport." He began, his voice slow and deliberate, carrying the cadence of a storyteller who knew the power of his words. "Clara's a grandmother, raised her kids, and now her grandkids on her own. She works 2 jobs, barely makes ends meet. Life's been tough on her, lost her son to illness a few years back. But every Sunday she walks to a little church down the road, sits in the back pew and prays. Not for an easier life, but for the strength to keep going. She told me once, 'Senator, my faith in Jesus is the only thing that holds me together when the world tries to tear me apart.'" The story hit the room like a quiet wave, its simplicity cutting through the polished energy of the set. The audience, accustomed to quick sound bites and fiery debates, felt the raw truth of Clara's struggle. A few people dabbed at their eyes, moved by the image of a woman finding solace in faith. Others nodded, drawn in by Kennedy's unpolished sincerity. Whoopi, though, hadn't expected this. She'd prepared for a theological argument, not a personal story that grounded faith in the grit of everyday life. Her smile tightened and she jumped in quickly, trying to pull the conversation back to her terms. "That's a beautiful story, Senator, and I'm sure Clara's faith means the world to her," she said, her tone gracious but with a hint of impatience, as if gently nudging a guest back on track. "But my question wasn't about personal stories. I'm asking about your belief that there's only one way to truth. Isn't that kind of stance a bit rigid for a world where people have the freedom to choose their own paths?" The question was sharper now, more direct, designed to put Kennedy on the defensive. The audience murmured, some nodding in agreement with Whoopi's point. She was, after all, a champion of open-hearted spirituality, a voice for those who sought meaning in meditation, self-help, or eclectic beliefs. Kennedy, with his unwavering Christianity, seemed to challenge that ethos of acceptance, and the crowd sensed the stakes rising. But Kennedy didn't take the bait. He nodded, acknowledging the question's weight, then leaned forward slightly. his hands clasped. "Whoopi, I'm not here to tell anybody they can't choose their path," he said, his voice steady but firm, carrying a quiet conviction that filled the room. "But you asked about my faith, and I've got to be honest. My faith says Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Those aren't just words to me, they're what I've seen change lives like Clara's. I'm not forcing that on anyone, but I can't keep quiet about something I know is real." The words landed with a force that stilled the audience. Some clapped softly, not out of blind agreement, but out of respect for his clarity. Others sat quietly absorbing the weight of his response. Whoopi's smile faltered for a moment, her confidence shaken by the senator's refusal to dodge or deflect. She'd expected to control the exchange, to guide it toward her vision of inclusive spirituality, but Kennedy was shifting the narrative, turning the conversation into something deeper, a moment that demanded attention. Sensing the shift, Whoopi pressed harder, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "Senator, you talk about truth like it's absolute, like your faith has the final word," she said, her eyes locked on his. "But what about the millions of people who find peace in other ways? Are you saying they're wrong, that their beliefs don't matter?" The question was a masterstroke, a rhetorical challenge designed to paint Kennedy as judgmental. If he said yes, he'd risk alienating the audience. If he said no, he'd weaken his own stance. The crowd leaned in the tension, thick, some nodding in approval of Whoopi's push. She was their voice, the advocate for a world where all paths were valid. Kennedy paused, not out of doubt, but to gather his thoughts. He looked at Whoopi, his gaze kind but unflinching. "Whoopi, I don't think it's about who's right or wrong," he said, his voice soft but resolute. "If I see someone struggling in deep water, I'm not going to tell them to keep swimming their own way. I'm going to throw them a rope. My faith is that rope. It's what I've seen pull people to safety. I'm just offering it to anyone who wants to grab hold." The analogy was simple but powerful, cutting through the noise with a clarity that resonated. The audience erupted in scattered applause, some clapping hesitantly, others with conviction. Even those who disagreed couldn't deny the sincerity in Kennedy's words. Whoopi's composure wavered, her hands gripping the table's edge. She hadn't anticipated a response so grounded, so disarming. As the segment neared its close, she glanced at the clock, realizing she'd lost her grip on the conversation. "That's a strong perspective, Senator," she said, her voice betraying a hint of strain. "We'll pick this up after the break." As the stage lights dimmed and the show cut to commercial, Whoopi looked at Kennedy, her eyes a mix of frustration and reluctant respect. The audience buzzed, sensing that what came next would be even more intense. Kennedy, meanwhile, sat quietly, his heart steady, ready for whatever lay ahead. The lights in the Views studio snapped back on, casting a warm glow over the set as the commercial break ended. The audience, still buzzing from the charged exchange in the first segment, settled into their seats, their eyes fixed on Whoopi Goldberg and Senator John Neely Kennedy. What had begun as a polished talk show discussion about spirituality was now something far more intense, a collision of worldviews that felt alive, unpredictable, and deeply personal. Whoopi, her usual confidence shaken by Kennedy's unyielding sincerity, knew she needed to regain control. She'd built her career on steering conversations, using her wit and charm to frame narratives that resonated with her audience. But Kennedy, with his quiet conviction and Louisiana drawl, was proving to be a formidable presence, one who didn't bend under pressure. As the cameras rolled, Whoopi adjusted her posture, her smile tight but professional, determined to shift the momentum back in her favor. She didn't yet realize that Kennedy's words were about to challenge not just her argument, but the very foundation of her approach to spirituality. "Welcome back, everyone." Whoopi began, her voice smooth, but carrying a subtle edge like a seasoned performer ready to reclaim the stage. We're here with Senator John Neely Kennedy, diving deep into faith, truth, and what it means to find purpose in today's world. Senator, you've shared some powerful thoughts about your Christian beliefs, and I appreciate your honesty. She paused, letting the audience absorb her gracious tone, a signal that she was still in charge. But let's get real for a moment. You're a public figure, someone with influence. When you talk about your faith so openly, especially in your work, some might say you're using it to connect with people emotionally, maybe even to sway them. How do you respond to the idea that your faith is a tool for political gain? The question was a calculated strike, designed to cast doubt on Kennedy's integrity. The audience stirred a low murmur rippling through the crowd. Accusations of exploiting faith for votes were a familiar critique in the world of politics, and Whoopi knew it. She was betting on Kennedy, stumbling, either getting defensive, which would make him seem evasive, or brushing off the question, which could paint him as dismissive. The camera zoomed in, capturing every nuance of his expression, but Kennedy didn't hesitate. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, its edges worn from handling. He held it briefly, not for effect, but as if it anchored him, then set it on his knee. "Whoopi," he said, his voice steady and warm, "let me tell you about a boy named Eli from Lake Charles." The audience leaned in, caught off guard by the shift. Kennedy's tone was soft, but commanding. The kind that drew you in and held you close. Eli's 9 years old, been fighting a heart condition since he was a baby. His family's been through more doctor visits than most folks can imagine. A while back, his mom wrote to me, said Eli saw me speak at a community event. I'd talked about faith, about how it gives us hope when life feels heavy. Eli looked at his mom and said, "If that man says God's with me, I can keep going." Kennedy paused, his eyes sweeping the audience, not to manipulate, but to share the weight of Eli's story. "I didn't share that to win votes, Whoopi. I shared it because kids like Eli and families like his need something real to hold on to. My faith isn't a strategy. It's why I show up every day." The studio fell silent. The raw truth of Kennedy's words settling over the crowd like a gentle fog. A few audience members wiped tears from their eyes, their faces softening with emotion. Others nodded as if Eli's courage had stirred something deep within them. Whoopi, caught off balance, felt a flicker of unease. She'd expected a political dodge, not a story that cut straight to the heart. Her platform thrived on emotional connection, but Kennedy's tale wasn't rehearsed or polished. It was real, unfiltered, and impossible to dismiss. She recovered quickly, her years of experience kicking in. "That's a moving story, Senator, and I don't doubt it means a lot to Eli's family," she said, her voice measured, but with a trace of tension. "But let's broaden this out. You're saying your faith drives you, and that's fine. But when you emphasize Christianity as the one true path, aren't you dismissing the millions of people who find meaning elsewhere? Don't you think that's a limited way to see the world?" The question was a pivot, a way to pull the discussion back to safer, more abstract ground. Whoopi was a master at framing spirituality as a universal journey where all paths, meditation, self-discovery, ancient wisdom led to the same truth. Kennedy's insistence on one path challenged that vision, and she needed to highlight its flaws. The audience murmured, some nodding in agreement, their loyalty to Whoopi's inclusive ethos clear. Kennedy, however, didn't waver. He leaned back slightly, his hands clasped, and gave her a look that was both respectful and resolute. "Whoopi, I'm not here to tell folks they can't search for meaning wherever they want," he said, his voice calm but carrying a quiet strength. "But let me ask you something. If you saw a friend lost in a storm, would you tell them to try every road, Or would you point them to the one that leads home? The analogy hit like a spark, simple but piercing, cutting through the haze of relativism with a clarity that resonated. The audience gasped softly, some clapping, before they realized it. Kennedy's words weren't an attack. They were an invitation, urging people to consider truth as something vital, not just one option among many. He continued, his tone gentle but firm. My faith isn't about shutting doors. It's about showing people the one I've found, the one that's carried me and others through the darkest nights. The studio erupted in scattered applause, a mix of hesitant and heartfelt claps. Even those who disagreed felt the weight of Kennedy's sincerity. Whoopi's smile tightened her mind, racing for a counterpoint. She hadn't expected him to turn the question back on her, and the audience's reaction, nods, murmurs of agreement, told her she was losing ground. That's a vivid metaphor. Senator, she said, her tone clipped but still professional. But you're not addressing the core issue. My work, my advocacy, it's about helping people find peace through all kinds of paths, mindfulness, community, whatever speaks to them. Are you saying that's meaningless just because it's not your faith? The question was a trap designed to paint Kennedy as dismissive of her legacy. If he criticized her work, he'd risk alienating the audience who saw Whoopi as a beacon of empowerment. If he endorsed it, he'd dilute his own message. The crowd leaned forward, sensing the stakes. Kennedy paused, not out of uncertainty, but to choose his words carefully. He looked at Whoopi, his eyes filled with a compassion that caught her off guard. Whoopi, I don't doubt you've helped folks feel better, and that's a good thing, he said softly. Your heart for people, your desire to lift them up, that matters. But feeling better isn't the same as finding what lasts. My faith says there's a deeper answer, one that doesn't fade when the hard days come. I'm not saying your work is meaningless. I'm saying it's not the whole story. The studio went quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy with meaning. Kennedy's words weren't harsh, but they were unflinching, exposing the gap between temporary comfort and lasting hope. The audience, many of whom had embraced Whoopi's message of self-empowerment, felt a stirring in their hearts. They'd been drawn to her promise of peace, but Kennedy was pointing to something more enduring, something that didn't depend on their own strength. Whoopi, for the first time, felt a crack in her carefully built facade. Her career rested on the idea that spirituality was a buffet of choices, each valid in its own way. Kennedy's faith challenged that, not with arrogance, but with a quiet certainty that was hard to dismiss. She tried to rally, her voice rising slightly. Senator, you keep talking about this one answer, this one truth, she said, her tone sharp now. But what about the billions of people who find joy, purpose, peace outside your beliefs? Are they all just mistaken? The audience clapped, emboldened by Whoopi's pushback. She was their advocate, the voice of a world that celebrated diversity in all its forms. Kennedy, with his singular focus, seemed to stand against that freedom. But Kennedy didn't back down. He reached for the folded paper on his knee, holding it like a touchstone. Whoopi, I'm not here to judge anyone's journey, he said, his voice steady but urgent. When I was younger, I looked for answers everywhere, books, ideas, philosophies. But nothing gave me peace until I found someone who said, "Come to me and I'll give you rest." That's not about being better than anyone else. It's about finding a truth that holds up when everything else falls apart. The words landed like a wave, washing over the audience with a force that left them breathless. Some clapped, others sat stunned, their minds grappling with the weight of what they'd heard. Kennedy wasn't preaching, he was sharing, and the difference was palpable. Whoopi's hands gripped the table, her composure fraying. She'd spent years championing a spirituality that embraced all paths, but Kennedy's message was piercingly clear, grounded in a conviction she couldn't easily shake. The audience was no longer just watching her. They were hanging on his words, drawn to a truth that felt both ancient and immediate. As the segment drew to a close, Whoopi glanced at the clock, her mind racing. "Senator, you've given us a lot to chew on," she said, her voice strained but still professional. "We'll dive deeper after the break." As the lights dimmed and the show cut to commercial, Whoopi looked at Kennedy, her eyes a mix of defiance and dawning respect. The audience buzzed, sensing the conversation was far from over. Kennedy, meanwhile, folded the paper and tucked it back into his pocket, his heart steady, ready for the next round. The studio lights of The View flared back to life, bathing the set in a golden glow as the commercial break ended. The audience, still reeling from the emotional intensity of the previous segments, sat in hushed anticipation, their eyes locked on Whoopi Goldberg and Senator John Neely Kennedy. What had started as a lively talk show debate about spirituality had transformed into a profound clash of perspectives, raw and unscripted, that held everyone in its grip. Whoopi, her confidence rattled by Kennedy's unwavering sincerity, felt the weight of the moment. She'd built her career on championing inclusivity, weaving a narrative of universal spirituality that resonated with millions. But Kennedy, with his quiet resolve and heartfelt stories, was dismantling her carefully crafted framework, not with aggression, but with a truth that cut deep. As the cameras rolled, Whoopi leaned forward, her smile professional but strained, determined to reclaim the narrative. She didn't yet realize that this segment would mark a turning point, not just for the show, but for her own heart. Kennedy, his small Bible tucked in his pocket, sat calmly, his face a blend of compassion and conviction, ready to meet whatever came next. "Welcome back to The View." Whoopi began, her voice steady, but carrying a sharp edge like a boxer sizing up an opponent. "We're here with Senator John Neely Kennedy, digging into faith, truth, and what it means to live with purpose. Senator, you've shared some compelling stories, and I respect your passion." She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly, signaling a shift. "But let's cut to the chase. Your faith says there's one way to truth, Jesus. That's a bold claim in a world full of different beliefs. Don't you think that kind of stance risks dividing people? Maybe even judging those who see things differently?" The question was a rhetorical landmine designed to paint Kennedy as divisive. If he affirmed his belief, he'd be seen as intolerant. If he wavered, he'd undermine his own faith. The audience leaned in the tension, palpable, some nodding, in agreement with Whoopi's challenge. She was their voice, the defender of a world where all paths were valid, and they trusted her to expose any hint of rigidity. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of Kennedy's expression. But Kennedy didn't flinch. He reached for the folded paper on his knee, not to show it, but to ground himself, then looked at Whoopi with a gaze that was both kind and unflinching. "Whoopi," he said, his voice low and steady, laced with the warmth of his Louisiana roots. "Let me tell you about a man named Amos from New Orleans." The audience stirred, drawn in by the promise of another story. Kennedy's tone was deliberate, like a storyteller who knew the power of his words. "Amos is a mechanic, works long hours to keep his family afloat. A few years back, he lost his daughter to a tough illness. It broke him, left him angry at the world. But one day, he walked into a small church not looking for answers, just a place to sit. The pastor there didn't preach at him, just sat with him, prayed with him. Amos told me later, "Senator, I found Jesus in that quiet moment, and it's the only thing that keeps me standing." Kennedy paused, his eyes sweeping the audience, inviting them into Amos's pain and hope. I'm not sharing that to divide anyone, Whoopi. I'm sharing it because people like Amos need a light in the dark. My faith isn't about judging, it's about offering a way out of the storm. The story landed like a soft thunderclap, its raw honesty silencing the room. A few audience members dabbed at their eyes, moved by the image of a grieving father finding solace. Others nodded, feeling the weight of Kennedy's words. Whoopi, caught off guard, felt a pang of unease. She'd expected a defensive argument, not another story that rooted faith in the struggles of real people. Her plan to frame Kennedy as divisive was slipping, and she needed to pivot. "That's a powerful story." "Senator," she said, her voice tight, masking her frustration. "But you're not answering the question. When you say Jesus is the only way, you're implying other paths. Buddhism, Islam, even my own beliefs are wrong. How is that not divisive in a world that needs unity?" The audience clapped, emboldened by Whoopi's pushback. She was hitting at the heart of her philosophy, spirituality, as a tapestry of equal truths. Kennedy's singular focus felt like a challenge to that vision, and the crowd sensed the stakes. Kennedy nodded, acknowledging the question's depth, then leaned forward, his hands clasped. "Whoopi, I'm not here to tear anybody down," he said, his voice calm but piercing. "But let me ask you this. If you knew a bridge was out and someone was about to drive over it, would you tell them to keep going their own way, or would you point them to the safe road?" The analogy struck like lightning, simple yet devastating, cutting through the fog of relativism with a clarity that resonated. The audience gasped, some clapping, instinctively drawn to the urgency in Kennedy's words. He continued, his tone gentle but firm. "My faith isn't about saying everyone else is wrong. It's about pointing to the road I know is safe, the one I've seen save lives. I'm not forcing anyone to take it. I'm just holding out the map." The studio erupted in applause, a mix of hesitant and heartfelt, as people grappled with the power of his response. Even those who disagreed couldn't deny the sincerity in his voice. Whoopi's smile faltered, her hands gripping the table's edge. She hadn't anticipated an answer so disarming, one that reframed her accusation as an act of compassion. The audience's reaction, nods, murmurs of agreement, signaled she was losing her hold. Desperate to regain ground, she leaned in, her voice sharp. "Senator, that's a nice way to put it. But let's be real," she said, her eyes locked on his. "You're a man with influence. When you push this one truth, you're shaping how people think, how they live. Isn't that a kind of power you're wielding, maybe even a dangerous one?" The question was bold, implying Kennedy's faith was a tool for control. The audience murmured, some nodding, others waiting for his response. Kennedy paused, not out of doubt, but to choose his words carefully. He looked at Whoopi, his eyes soft but resolute. "Whoopi," he said, his voice steady. "Power's a funny thing. You can use it to lift yourself up or to lift others. My faith isn't about control, it's about freedom. Freedom from fear, from despair, from chasing things that don't last. I talk about Jesus because I've seen what he does for people like Amos, like me." He held up the folded paper, his voice growing quieter, but more intense. "This is a note from Amos's wife thanking me for speaking about hope. That's why I'm here, not to push anyone, but to share what pulls people through." The studio fell silent, the weight of Kennedy's words settling over the crowd. A few people clapped softly, others sat stunned, their hearts stirred by his conviction. Whoopi's face softened, her defenses cracking. She'd spent years advocating for a spirituality that embraced all paths, but Kennedy's faith was grounded in a truth she couldn't easily dismiss. For the first time, she felt exposed not as a host, but as a person wrestling with her own beliefs. "Senator," she said, her voice quieter, almost vulnerable, "I hear you, but I've helped people find peace, my way, through mindfulness, through community. Are you saying that's not enough?" The question wasn't a trap this time. It was a plea, raw and honest. The audience held their breath, sensing the shift. Kennedy looked at her, his eyes filled with compassion. "Whoopi, what you've done matters. Helping people find peace is a gift," he said softly. "But peace that fades when life gets hard isn't enough. My faith points to something that holds no matter what. I'm just inviting you and everyone here to look at it." The studio felt transformed, the air thick with meaning. Whoopi sat back, her eyes glistening, her mind racing. She'd come to challenge Kennedy, but his words had challenged her, stirring questions she hadn't faced before. As the segment ended, she managed a shaky smile. "We'll wrap this up after the break," she said, her voice barely steady. The lights dimmed and the audience buzzed, knowing the final segment would be unforgettable. Kennedy sat quietly, his heart steady, ready for what lay ahead. The View's studio lights glowed softly as the final segment began, the air heavy with a reverent hush. The audience, captivated by the raw intensity of the past hour, sat in quiet anticipation, their eyes fixed on Whoopi Goldberg and Senator John Neely Kennedy. What had started as a spirited debate about spirituality had become a profound encounter, stripping away the polish of a talk show to reveal something deeper, a shared search for truth. Whoopi, her usual poise shaken by Kennedy's unyielding yet compassionate responses, felt a shift within her. She'd come to challenge his faith, but his stories and quiet conviction had stirred questions she couldn't ignore. As the cameras rolled, she clasped her hands tightly, her face a mix of resolve and vulnerability. Kennedy, his small Bible in his pocket, sat calmly, his eyes warm with empathy, ready to meet this moment with the same sincerity he'd brought all along. This wasn't about winning. It was about offering hope, whatever it might cost. "We are back for our final segment." Whoopi began, her voice softer, stripped of its earlier edge. "Senator Kennedy, you've given us so much to think about. Your faith, your stories, they're powerful. But I need to understand something." She paused, her eyes searching his as if seeking an anchor. "How can you be so sure your way, Jesus, is the only truth? I've spent my life helping people find peace through mindfulness, community, all kinds of paths. Are you saying that's all wrong?" The question was raw, not a challenge, but a genuine plea. The audience leaned in, sensing the weight of her words. Whoopi, the unshakable host, was showing a crack in her armor, and they were witnessing it live. Kennedy reached for the folded paper on his knee, holding it gently, then looked at her with a kindness that disarmed the room. "Whoopi," he said, his voice warm and steady, "I'm not here to say everything you've done is wrong. I'm just a man who found a truth that changed me. When I was lost, Jesus didn't ask me to fix myself. First, he met me right where I was broken and all. That's not a judgment on anyone else. It's a lifeline I want to share." He leaned forward, his words deliberate. "You've helped folks find peace, and that's real. But peace that fades when life hits hard isn't enough. We need hope that lasts, and I believe Jesus offers that." The audience sat still, some nodding, others wiping tears, stirred by the simplicity of his words. Whoopi's hands trembled slightly, her mind wrestling with his response. She'd built a career on empowering people to find their own truth. But Kennedy's faith pointed to something beyond self-reliance, something eternal. She tried to respond, her voice catching. "Senator, I've seen lives change through my work." "Are you saying that doesn't matter? Because it's not your faith." Her tone held a hint of defense, But beneath it was a deeper question. What if I've missed something? Kennedy smiled gently, his eyes full of understanding. Whoopi, what you've done matters. Kindness always does, he said. But the question isn't just about feeling better. It's about finding what makes us whole. Jesus didn't come to make us comfortable. He came to make us new. That's what I'm holding on to. The studio fell silent, his words resonating like a quiet hymn. The audience, many of whom had embraced Whoopi's inclusive spirituality, felt a stirring in their hearts. Kennedy wasn't preaching. He was inviting, and the difference was profound. Whoopi's face softened, her eyes glistening. In a moment that would echo beyond the studio, she stood, her voice breaking. Senator, I've always thought I was helping people, but if I've been pointing them to something temporary, what does that mean for me? The admission hung in the air, vulnerable and real. The audience gasped, their icon revealing a doubt they'd never seen. Kennedy stood too, not to claim victory, but to meet her in that space. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his voice tender. Whoopi, it means you're human, like all of us. The good news is, you don't have to have it all figured out. Jesus takes our questions, our mistakes, and makes something beautiful. That's grace. Tears welled in Whoopi's eyes, and she didn't hide them. The audience, many crying too, watched in awe as Kennedy spoke softly, not for the cameras, but from the heart. Jesus said, "Blessed are those who know they need him." That's where it starts, with an open heart. The studio felt sacred, the pretense of performance gone. Whoopi nodded, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know how to let go of being in control. Kennedy smiled. That's where he meets you, right where you are. As the show ended, there was no fanfare, just a gentle applause, not for spectacle, but for courage. In the months that followed, Whoopi quietly shifted her focus, engaging in small acts of service, visiting community centers, supporting families seeking a deeper truth. Kennedy continued his work, his faith unchanged, but his humility deepened. The lesson was clear. Truth spoken with love can touch even the hardest hearts. Faith thrives in sincerity, not flash, and real change begins with listening, not arguing. The story challenges us to ask, what truths are we holding on to? Are we brave enough to let them shape us? True hope lies in humility, in opening our hearts to what lasts: love, grace, and a truth that endures.